I'm Joe Hochreiter, your host for Freeform Philly on the Freeform channel of the Arts Validation Network, TAVN.org. I open tonight's show with Second Opinion from pianist and composer George Burton's first album, 2016's uniquely titled The Truth of What I Am, The Narcissist. We'll talk about that title in a minute, but let me introduce, for the artist interview, George Burton.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. Glad to have you on the show. Just as background, you and your wife, Charla, were kind enough to host me a couple weeks ago in Greenwich Village, Smalls Jazz Club, to see another Burton's quartet, Abraham. And I understand there's no relation, so we've been through that. But a
Yeah,
great guy,
uh-huh.
a very good band leader, soulful tenor sax player.
hmm
I wanted to get to know you a bit, though, before this interview, because you're going to be performing as the featured soloist at the Kimmel Center here in Philly when the No Name Pops will present Timeless, a tribute to the legacy of Peter Nero. Let's start with your history with the original Philly Pops, and particularly your interactions with Peter, because they were fairly substantial.
Yeah, I'm from Philadelphia. So growing up in Philadelphia, kind of have to know about Peter and the Pops and all the things that, they were doing at the time. I'm as Philly bred as Philly bred can be. I grew up playing violin and viola and piano. And, it's over time, I kind of became a pianist to a certain extent. I still think of myself as a violist. It's a whole thing. But I started getting into jazz because a lot of my friends were into jazz. And because I was playing violin and viola, I was really, really into classical at the same time. So I had this dual thing that started happening at, I guess, a fairly young age. And time went on, and I was able to take advantage of all the programs in Philadelphia, like Settlement Music School, Temple University Prep. There's so many, and still are so many amazing programs that was happening at the time. And what comes with that is the musicians who are actually in the community, who are actually working for, like the Philadelphia Orchestra. We have like Renard Edwards, and you have, people who are working with the Pops. And what a lot of these teachers and players would do is they would like come down and like really show us a lot of things and how it's actually supposed to happen and what's the music is actually about and how it's supposed to move, how it's supposed to feel, where you're supposed to listen to. And Peter, being the part of Pops, he had a very interesting way of combining various genres and styles, which is something that I want to say doesn't happen too often, but it does happen a lot. From my perspective, he had the unique ability to be able to take the finer parts of classical and the finer parts of jazz and really, really make it this big picture, much larger than just style of music itself. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it
Um,
does. And was he sort of the first person that introduced you to breaking outside of these genre boxes?
I wouldn't say he was the first person. He did make me look at music a little bit differently. Made me look at music in a way to connect music together a little bit more, taking bits here, bits there, where in most situations before that and most situations after that, it was either I'm either playing jazz or I'm either playing this style of music or I'm either playing just this style of music, which all has their own rules and own particular guidelines that you're supposed to follow. He was one of the few people that I went, oh, so you can do this and you can do that and you can add a little bit of this, and you can add a little bit of that, and you can make it all a very unique thing and it be very respected at the same time. Um,
Yes,
I say
exactly.
that because I've heard like a lot of music where I'm like, okay, so they're trying to combine these two styles of music, and it kind of sounds cheesy. Um,
Yeah,
it's yeah,
I
but
remember growing up with back FM radio back in the 60s was populated. There were some classical stations, but there was also this thing called Beautiful Music, which was just kind of syrupy, nothing music, but it had a full orchestra. So, it was, but
right.
there was zero depth. It was just kind of nothing.
Yeah, there's a lot of music out there like that, But here's the thing that's beautiful about it, or I'm just going to say more beautiful about like the city of Philadelphia itself, is like there was a certain standard that Philadelphians, like if you were in Philadelphia, you had to like adhere to a certain standard of musicianship that didn't allow the watered down idea of music to really seep in. I don't Even in the smooth jazz scene, it's like you had Grover Washington, who was on a very, very high level musically. You look at the R&B scene, like all the cats, they were on a very, very high level musically.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's for me, it's that was Peter was took that and made sure it stayed where it was.
Going into this concert, which will be, well, we're recording this in mid March, but it'll be about a month from now. What's your approach going to be as the featured soloist pianist with the orchestra at this performance? I know you've seen the charts for the show, and, obviously this is a tribute to Peter Nero, but this is also George Burton playing piano. So I'm really interested to see what your approach to that whole thing is all about. How does George Burton, the artist, come in and also pay homage to the unique sound of Peter Nero?
Interesting. I was talking to Charlotte the other day because I've been going through this music for a while, and it takes it's one of these things when you're like the soloist, you try to play music enough to the point that you believe it's yours, if that makes sense at all. So it's like I'm playing through like a bunch of Peter's arrangements, and it's like I'm slowly starting to get to like the point where I'm like, ah, I hear it in my own head as opposed to I'm hearing Peter play it, which then opens up a whole nother world of ideas that I can add, that I can take away, or I just hear it in a much larger picture, which allows me to open it up a little bit more and put my own ideas and my own spin onto a lot of it. And saying that, I don't want to take away the beauty of what Peter did. It's like, yes, I'm going to be me, but I want to make sure I adhere to a certain standard that he set from the jump.
Yeah,
Um,
and to me that seems, particularly as sort of really a non-musician, that seems like a bit of a balancing act.
I mean, isn't it always a balancing act?
I think so. But it's one thing when you are performing with your quartet and you're George Burton, even if you're, doing a jazz standard,
Mm-hmm.
because you truly get to be George interpreting this piece. When you're doing a tribute to another artist, because you were, as I understand, a winner of a piano competition that
Yeah.
was the Peter Nero competition,
Yeah, it
actually.
was.
So, so you have a little bit of a psychic connection there that's beyond just, yeah, I met him and he taught me some things.
I was thinking about that, since I've been looking at Peter's stuff a little bit more, and I was thinking about that particular competition because that happened some years ago, and I hadn't really thought about it in a while. I went into it not really expecting to win. I'm not like a big competition person. I just like, oh, let's just see what happens. And I remember one of the judges, like all the pianists could play, they were amazing players. And I remember one of the judges after I was like, so how did I win? Like I like in my mind, I'm like, well, this guy can play, everybody can play. Like, why did I get picked? And one of the judges, Jim Miller, I don't know if he was a drummer in Philadelphia. He passed away, I believe, 2020-ish. And what he said to me was, the judges talked and you knew what the idea of music actually was, as opposed to just playing a bunch of notes that fit in this very specific thing. That I think that's like the connection that we have more than anything else, understanding that music is just bigger than a bunch of notes that's placed in front of you. And that's everything. I was going through his music. I was checking out, he has this version of one of these pieces and he quotes Carmen in it, the opera. And it was like kind of like, so you hear all of that in this, and you hear, and then there's another quote in there that you hear all of that in this also. And it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting because it's like no longer just like one little box, like it has to be this very particular thing. And it's the world is just open, and that's how I've fortunately growing up in Philly, that's how I've always kind of looked at music as like the much larger picture. Besides, like once you have your technique, once you can play, you want to actually make music for the idea of music, not for like what people perceive it to be. You just want to. That's the beauty of it. Or at least that's what I find the beauty in it.
Sort of a corollary to that, I would think, is that, and there's a lot of young people that I've seen, because I was president of a youth orchestra here in Bucks County for a lot of years, and we were not this way, but there are some youth orchestras that are like this, where we're going to drill into you and drill into you that you're going to play this perfectly, and
Mm-hmm.
technique is everything.
Mm-hmm.
And, it seems to me that for many of the kids that get driven that way, the joy in the music sort of disappears. Doesn't seem
Yeah.
that that happened with you.
Um, I was definitely drilled.
Okay.
I was definitely drilled. I mean, I was one of those kids that I mean, I had really, really amazing teachers. My parents allowed me to take lessons with amazing teachers. I myself is just, somebody was saying this to me. I was doing another interview about six months ago or 4 months ago. The interviewer was saying, he was like, you seem like very curious. And then somebody else said that to me, and they were like, you're just curious. And I thought about it. I was like, have I always been like curious? And I'm always checking things out at every point in time. It's like I grew up playing violin and viola. I was like, concertmaster at Kappa, and then I was, first year viola, but that was classical. I was checking out everything in classical, but at the same time, I'm like listening to what's happening in this ensemble over here. Like, well, what are they doing? Like, and I would sit down and actually listen to these ensembles. And then I'd go somewhere else and I really started checking out these things. And it's interesting. We sort of kind of talked about this a little bit before. Like my high school years was like classical, classical, classical. The end of high school was like jazz. I really started getting into jazz piano. And my whole experience with music up to that point was either in the classical realm or jazz or gospel music because I grew up in church. That was pretty much everything that I knew until I got to like a little bit out of college. I started checking out like rock bands. I guess they call it avant rock, but it was like I was getting into Bjork, and I was like,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
what is this? Like, like her voice is different, and how does her voice work with this particular texture of music? And I've never heard music actually being played or performed like this, and some of this sounds like machines and synthesizers, and like that was so foreign to me because I'm like, piano sounds like a piano. Violin sounds like,
Mm-hmm.
I was like, well, you can't use electronic. It kind of cheapens it. I was like, but it's not cheap here. And it just made me more curious about other things. And I started checking out other groups and other groups. And we sort of talked about this. I really got obsessed with like a group called Cigarillos for like maybe like a good portion of like 5 years. And what was interesting that I started looking for things in their music that could be connected to other styles of music. One of the beautiful things that they do is they have this amazing way of using space and building tension in space. And I was like, well, they're not playing a lot of notes. And how are like at the end of the piece, I'm like ready to jump through the window and I'm screaming, so much intensity. And I thought about that and like thinking about like John Coltrane and like, wait, so he uses space a little bit differently and he's still building this insane amount of tension. Like, how can you these things are connected in a way, but just understanding how to build tension in different ways was either, playing a lot or you play using space differently, or, where I want to say like pressure points to make things like cross that extra line, to take it up that one extra notch. So I'm just naturally curious. So I check out everything.
There was a band in the 70s. They were originally called the Dixie Dregs. They became the Dregs.
Mm-hmm.
And they were clearly a rock band, but Mark O'Connor for several years was the violinist in
Mm-hmm.
that band.
Amazing player.
He's an
Mark.
incredible player.
Yeah.
And actually, we ended up doing a concert with him. The Youth Orchestra of Bucks County did a concert with him over at Patriots Theater in Trenton.
Mm-hmm.
And he has an improvised four movement work that he does. So basically the orchestra plays the charts and then he just improvises on it. When I finally got to meet him, it came together in my mind. Holy mackerel! This guy that I now see in a bluegrass and classical context, he was that guy in the Dregs.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
just got me so excited for the sound of the violin, but in a very different way.
Right. Right. I mean,
So
that's the beauty of it, right? It's like finding a voice or your voice in other genres that you make it your own, and it changes you
absolutely.
like fundamentally. It changes like how you hear music. It changes how you move in music. It changes like what you'll listen to next. It's like a whole thing. So
We talked about because I mentioned in the context of you being a Philly guy and you studying jazz and violin that I had mentioned John Blake, and it astonished me that not only did you know John Blake, but your mother, I think, was actually she played with him.
yeah, they were friends. They were friends. Philadelphia, I've been talking a lot about this like to people. Like it was like a very special time. My mom is a violinist. She was a violin teacher for the Philadelphia School District for 30 years, itinerant music teacher. And there was a community of African American string players. And that's, and out of that came John Blake, Diane Monroe, Renard Edwards, Booker Rowe. So it was like this community of string players, and they all knew each other because they came out of Philadelphia School District around the same time, and they stayed in Philly, and I was the next generation. the next generation of me was Jonathan Blake, the drummer. So we grew up knowing each other because our parents knew each other. So when I started getting into jazz, and this is, I'm laughing because it's like, this is the interesting thing about it is when I started getting into jazz, my mom was like, "Hey, I know this jazz violinist." And I was like, she was like, "You should take lessons with him." And I was like, "Oh, cool." And I'm like, "Oh, Mr. Blake," not really knowing who Mr. Blake was in the world of
Yeah,
jazz. Like
yeah.
when you grow up under these people, it's just like, "Oh yeah, that's Mr. Blake," or that's Jonathan's dad, because Jonathan was playing violin at the time. I'm always joking. I was in first violin, he was in second violin. I didn't really realize who he was. So I took lessons from him. I just knew him all these years. And it was later on I started to realize, like, wait, you're like John Blake. Like, and then I started to learn who like McCoy Tyner was. I was like, it's like, and I was like looking at this guy, like, wait, you're and like, a lot of
You
things
were in the
really
presence
started
of
to,
greatness and you were
yeah,
starting to figure it
I
out.
had no idea. I was just a kid in Philly, like with a violin and viola walking around taking lessons. It's like the same thing with like Renard Everett. It's like kind of like, hey, wait, you're in a Philly orchestra. Like, wait, you're like, it's you just don't know when you're a kid sometimes. And that was my whole entire community was musicians. So like you just,
Yeah.
if you're hanging out with the Prince all the time, he's just like, John, but and then until you realize like, oh, he's like the Prince of wherever, so
Well, that's kind of a great organic way to get to know people because, you put them on a pedestal, you almost can get intimidated. But if they're just John and you guys start doing
you,
things together, then
you
all
just
of a
start
sudden you start
talking.
absorbing it.
Yeah, you just start talking and he's like, oh, check this out and check this out. And that's the beauty of like, real lessons. You're just going into a small room and you study with the teacher and they tell you to play this, you tell you to play that. But a lot of real lessons happen not they don't happen in the classroom, as we know. It happens like you see somebody on a gig and they say, "Go, oh, check that out. Check out what he's doing right there." Or you see something, "Oh, check that out over there." Or, "Did you hear that? What do you think about that? You see how that could fit into this?" Those are like the real lessons, and like you can only get that when you really, when you know your teacher, when you know the people who are in the business, who are in the music, who are in the, who are doing these things, and you can naturally just ask questions without that, what you were saying, intimidation, without that fear of like
Hmm.
feeling wrong. And everybody's I haven't really run into anybody who's like, "Oh, I'm going to hold on to all this information and not tell you." Like people are pretty willing to be like, "Yeah, I think this is great. This is killing for these reasons." And then you get in the conversation, "Well, I think this is killing for these reasons," or "I think this is terrible for all these reasons." But you're naturally having these conversations, which you're learning from, and
Yeah.
you're forming a idea of what music is and the quality of music is for you.
You and I also discussed something really significant happened here in Philly about 3 weeks ago. There was a decision made. Actually, it was a gift given by Leslie Ann Miller and her husband, Richard Worley. Richard was the former Philadelphia Orchestra board chair. They donated $25 million to change the name of the hall that you're going to perform in, Verizon Hall,
Yeah.
to the Marian Anderson Hall. And as a Philly native yourself and an African American musician, I'd like to know how significant you think that is that a major U.S. performance hall is going to be named in honor of someone really as meritorious as Mariam.
So I heard about this. It popped up on my phone that everybody walks around staring at all the time. But it was one of these news things that popped up, and I'll be honest. The first thing that I thought before, I was like, "Oh yeah, Mary Anderson." But the first thing I thought was, so donors did not name a hole after themselves that they paid the money for.
Mm-hmm.
And I
That's right.
went, that's a very amazing thing from the jump. That's a start. Like, hey, this is my money. I'm going to be my hall. I am the king. You can see me now. It was like not that. And I went, oh, and they picked Marion. Miss Anderson, like she's legendary. She's like the Marion Anderson for all the reasons that if you know her work, for all the reasons and all the things that she went through to become Marion Anderson and having, you know, performing on the White House lawn and all these things. It's like that's a major thing, and it represents who we have become in a lot of ways, if I may say, as a or where we're striving to become as a community or as a society. She's legend. She's all the legends, and I mean, Marian Anderson. That's a beautiful thing. And
Yeah,
she
and I think it's the only major U.S. Concert hall that is going to be named for someone with that resume, a civil rights activist of that stature.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. And that's how history is kept alive.
Absolutely. And it becomes more alive
Right.
because every little kid that goes into that hall, if they don't know who she is, they're going to ask, they're going to
Right.
find out.
Right.
You and I had talked before this interview. I thought this was a significant event since we are doing a concert. It'll be about maybe 2 months before the rededication ceremony. I had asked if you would take some time in your stage announcements, the time you're going to spend on stage, to make a personal statement about what has happened and why you think it's important. I'd like our audience to hear directly from someone who grew up in this city and was influenced by all the people that you were influenced by, to hear how important this thing is, because I think you and I both agree this is huge.
Oh, this is absolutely huge. I mean, it's important. I mean, it represents one, it represents change. Two, it represents, what society, us as society has, I sort of said this earlier, has moved on. Anderson, she was born in Philly, and this is like so amazing. Where a lot of African American kids can look up to and see, they can see something to strive for, something to look up to, something to achieve, something to, and it's one of those things that she's not around to see it herself, but it's like you've had such a profound impact on the community of Philadelphia, and being that you're from here and being all the amazing things that you've done, that you get a huge haul to inspire more people going forward. Um,
Absolutely. There are a lot of kids that probably didn't think that the stuff that goes on in Verizon Hall would be of any interest to them. With Marion's name on that hall, I don't know that those kids can reach that conclusion.
no, no, no. I mean, let's say it's Verizon halls. It's they think of their cell phones. There's not, as we were saying earlier, they're going, "So, can you hear me now?" Like that's, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, we're in Verizon Hall. Can you hear the orchestra now? But now it has a concrete thing. It has a symbolism. It has it's so much.
The Truth of What I Am, the Narcissist. I love that title, but I didn't understand it when I first read it. You and I have only met one time before, and I think I'm a fairly decent judge of character. And I can't imagine Charlotte settling for a narcissist, and I know that you're not a
No,
narcissist.
so
But but it was interesting because I think you really intended this to mean something very different, but people had to dig a little bit to get the meaning. So
so this is funny. Is if you look at the title on the album, it's the truth of what I am, and then there's a greater than sign, like the math
yeah,
sign. So the
I
name of
missed
the,
that.
yeah, it's some of like little nerds like sliding little things in.
Yes, yes. And you and
um,
I did agree. We're both nerds, and nerds are cool. So I get it.
yeah, yeah, okay. But so the name is the actual name of the album is the truth of what I am is greater than a narcissist. That was my first album, and I thought a lot about it. Like, okay, so what type of music do I want to be? What do I want to have on it? Like, what level of playing do I want? And talking to a good friend of mine, he was like, when you want the album to be about you and your playing, or do you want it to be? And like that stuck in my head, and I went, well, what do you mean? And he was like, well, when artists put out an album, it's usually it features them, it's all about them. And then when you go to sell your album, you go to put it on the market, you have to be me, 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 me. Look at me now, look at me now, look at me now, look at me now. And that like really stuck to me. And I was like, oh, I'm not really that type of person. And this is like social media. This is like 2016, and social media was like really me, 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 as it is now.
Yeah, well, it still is. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was just kind of like, there's so much more. I like to think there's so much more to me than just me putting out an album to advertise my music and my ideas of what music can be. So I don't, that was what that is. It was like a kind of a play on society and a play on the idea of me and I and how I want to be seen. But it's something that I think a lot of people would be able to connect to, especially in this day and age, or any age for that matter. There's bigger things than just me and I, and certain narcissistic behaviors prevent us from seeing larger pictures sometimes.
I think that's an excellent message. Let's take a quick break. I'd like to play Tiki from your sophomore album, Reciprocity, and then we can discuss the focus of that album and particularly that track on the backside.
Okay.
All right, I'm back with George Burton here on Freeform Philly on the Arts Validation Network, the Freeform channel. I'm your host, Joe Hochreiter. You know, critics focused on your desire in this album to transcend or even ignore genre boundaries. And this track was done, for example, with an Icelandic rock band, Sigaris. I found this track hugely melodic, but some jazz purists may not really know or care to approach it. What are your thoughts about that? And I think, in a way, you're trying to get people outside of boxes and into a bigger space.
So that whole album, I'm laughing at myself. Was I didn't purposely try to like push out of boxes, but in making that album and developing the concept behind that whole album, I didn't want to be locked into a very specific thing to make the jazz audience happy. The jazz audience is going to be the jazz audience. They're going to love it. They're going to hate it. It's just one of those things. They're going to say it's really good. It was really terrible. I did my first album. I was like, okay, we're going to play. We're going to all out. We're going to, this one I kind of looked at it differently. And that particular song was a track by it was written by Sigaros, who I was talking about earlier. The idea of that, like if you hear the track by itself with the band actually playing it, there's no drums on it. And it feels like open space. It's such a simple idea, but it builds the whole time. So in my head, I kind of went, I wonder if I can swing on this and keep the essence of what that particular track is, or what that particular song is, or the particular idea of how it was initially introduced to me, or how I initially heard it. And the idea was to build tension in this space without having to play a whole lot,
Mhm.
utilizing the idea, utilizing simple phrases, utilizing the band as a collective, not like a band like I'm soloing now. So it's like it's a whole band thing that we have to do together to get there. And that's like a big thing. There's another track on there that a lot of people loved it, called Finding. And it's almost like a singer-songwriter track, but it also swings. It's in three, but it sounds like a singer-songwriter track. And that was like me saying, or me trying to go, I can get this very particular sound to swing, and that kind of weird, but I had a video done, a stop motion video done by an amazing artist, Sigmund Washington. It went along with that particular track. And a lot of that was talking about boxes and being out the box and just thinking differently and just trying to bring things in that you wouldn't actually see all the time in music, or, and it was a stop motion video that they don't really do in jazz. That was like, it's kind of,
You and Charla have two daughters,
mm-hmm.
and your wife is a music therapist. What kind of musical language do you hope for your two girls to adopt as they grow up?
I just want them to have really good taste. I
What
just
does
want
that
them to have
mean?
that. That means a lot. It's such a loaded, like, so me and Charlotte, we're both music nerds. Like, she knows all this music. Like, when I met her, she was like, I know all this music. And I was like, huh, and where'd you come from? And then she knew I knew all this music, and we were just kind of looking at each other like, we have a very eclectic taste, I guess you would call it. We listen to everything. There's hip hop in the house, there's classical music in the house, there's rock in the house. There's like legit everything, and we know we dive deep into every single one of these genres, and our kids are always exposed to it, and they haven't mentioned anything that was terrible yet that they're listening to,
Okay.
or what I think is terrible, and I'm okay with that. I don't want to force. I don't want to force an idea of like, this is terrible. You can't listen to this, because then I think they'll just like dig into it more, and they'll be like, okay, this fell. But
You figured out how to be a parent then.
yes, yeah, it's a long learning experience that's going to keep going, I'm assuming. But we just, just understanding what quality is and what quality and what is garbage, and the reasons why, and all the reasons why. I talk about marketing. Like, this is good because of this, but this is just all marketing and flash, and this. That doesn't mean the music is good. And then hopefully they can
Mhm.
understand what that is. They can pick up by the ears and go, this is really good. This is terrible. This is just, hopefully they'll, you know that's what I just want them to be able to do.
Are
My
either of them taking up an instrument at this point?
my youngest is. My youngest
Okay,
is like, she has that. She's 6, but she has that thing in her eye when music comes on,
cool.
and I'm like, Is that it? You know, my oldest is really much, she's very much into art. So she's taking art classes and she's drawing all the time and making
Good.
videos, and she's a storyteller.
Excellent. Well, that's what songwriting in a lot of ways is
Oh, it
storytelling.
is.
Yeah,
It is.
that's it. I want to follow on a discussion we started when we met in New York City. I think you clearly see jazz evolving in a way that includes fusions into other musical styles. And we talked about other artists that I see doing that, like Kamasi Washington, Esperanza Spalding. I think all of you are on a somewhat similar journey. We're recording this interview actually on the day that the president is giving his State of the Union here in the U.S. So I want to ask you, what do you think the state of the music is today? Jazz.
That's a loaded question for me. There's the state of the music and there's the state of the business.
Oh,
And
let's put business aside, hopefully.
okay, because my thing about that is I think the music is in a good place, and there's so much good music out there, you know. And we talk about Kamasi, we talk about, you know, all these great artists that are out there. There's Emmanuel Wilkins, he's killing it. He's from Philadelphia, whose album was one of the top 10 albums for the New York Times, I believe, in 2021. But he's bringing in all types of sounds also. You know, he's bringing in the language of jazz, you know, quote unquote, that we've been taught, but he's hearing other things outside of that. And I think it's really good. You know, I think the state of jazz is going to keep evolving. It's going to keep pushing forward. It's always going to be there. You know, there's the whole argument right now that's going on about like education, and education is killing this, and it's kind of weird. It's the music always has a way of getting out and evolving and changing as time goes forward. You know.
No, I get it. I agree. It's interesting to me because when I studied jazz as an art form in college, I took a course on it. You know, you had your very sort of defined periods. You know, there was, you know, New Orleans, everything started, and before that there were you know, there were roots to what became jazz, and you sort of had big band, you had bop, and all the different variations, West Coast jazz. You've seen the tree of jazz, you know, with all these
Mm-hmm.
different branches. It gets harder for a listener that's not producing the music to know if some next big thing, some new bop is going to come into the art form, or if it's just going to stay so diffuse and blended that it won't be it at some point. It's just going to be a whole lot of things. And I'm wondering how you think about that.
So, you know, my wife talks about since the internet came the death of the monoculture. And what happens is periods of jazz or periods of any type of music is somewhat a part of the monoculture where everybody's this is you're told this is what is the cool thing at the time, and it stays cool as long as, you know, in the next 10 years from then they say this is what it is now, and next 10 years after that they say this is what it is now, and this is the cool thing, this is the period. I think since Spotify and Apple Music, I think that the periods of jazz aren't going to happen as much as they used to, because everybody has access to listen to the type of jazz and the type of new artists they want to listen to, and they don't have to dig as hard or be introduced. Like, you know, when I was growing up, I listened to, you know, WRTI, and they were like, okay, so these are all the artists that you should be listening to that have albums out now. And like outside of that, it was really sometimes it was kind of hard to figure out the other people who were putting out albums. Like I would have to, you know, you look on the back of a CD and you would see their names, and you look for an album that maybe they put out, and then you do that. It's not so much that anymore. It's just all out there. So people kind of, you know, people are kind of like grabbing at, you know, different places and staying in there. There's like the Kamasi Washington people, and then there's like the Esperanza people, and then there's like the Robert Glasper people, you know, and they kind of stay in their, you know, their thing, but it's all happening at the same time, and everybody's getting, I'm not saying everybody's getting a fair play, but everybody, the music is there to be taken advantage of if you're introduced to it. As we're talking about radio, I think radio is a very important thing, that's guides people on a very particular path. You know, if you have a good DJ who actually studies the music and is into music, they can put together a good set of music and introduce people to a lot of different things that are quality. You know, that's my idea of what it is. Not
Cool.
even sure if I answered the question.
No, I think you did. Your most recent album, and it was just released last year, is called the Yule log. And I didn't realize this until I did a little bit of research, but you've done at least a decade of Yule log shows. And I think most, if not all of them, have been produced in Philly. Is that right?
Yep.
Sean Brady, who is a reviewer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, this is another one of these headlines I just loved. But he didn't write this headline. You said it.
I did.
The Christmas album for deep depression and drinking.
Yeah.
And I love that. But again, you can't just listen to what George Burton says. You got to dig a little deeper. And in reality, and this self-depreciating style of humor that you have really sort of reveals something very, very different. You really wanted to go into what I guess some would call old chestnuts in the holiday season and really get into the true meaning of them and explore them in that context. Am I right about that?
Yeah, absolutely right. The Christmas genre, it's a very specific, it happens every year. Everybody pumps out chestnuts on open, white Christmas,
Mm-hmm.
all the hits. And I grew up because I grew up in church. There's two things that happen. I was thinking about this. There's two things that happened for me growing up. One is I grew up in church. When the Christmas holiday would come around, the biggest thing that was instilled in me was the reason for the season. It wasn't Santa Claus. It wasn't. It was like it was Jesus Christ and the birth and da 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 da, and that was the reason. So there was this really really huge impactful thing that was like a heavy weight that was instilled in us. So when I think of Christmas, I think of that heavy weight, and I think about family and all the things that you go through during the year. It's like it's and around that time people start you start figuring things out. You start thinking about this past year. Some people get depressed around that time of year. Some people get really really happy around that time of year. But I wanted that music to represent all of these emotional things that happen, not just the Hallmark holiday, because that I don't really know much about that.
Mm-hmm.
I see it, but it's not something we ever subscribe to. So that was my idea of what the holiday music is supposed to be, and I wanted it to have some fire behind it. I wanted it to be an emotional thing. Hopefully, I got that done. And the other side of it was, I remember this when we were talking about John Blake earlier. The gallery many many years ago, we're talking like the 80s, early 90s, they had a Christmas tree and they had musicians playing on it every year. And something I remember it because John Blake was doing it sometimes. I believe Miss Diane Monroe was on it. My old teacher from high school would do it. Like it was like all these Philadelphia musicians would do this thing. And I remember always going, these arrangements are amazing. As a kid, I'm like listening to it. I'm like, that's Jingle Bells. Like, yeah, that's a really amazing. And I wanted to arrange the music so that it was actually good to listen to, not just like you put strings in the background and you have them play through the chord changes. So I wanted it to be like, a little bit fiery. I wanted to be have that juice behind it. So it's much more to the album than just Chris. That's why I didn't call it like Christmas Time Is Here or anything like that. It's called the Yule log. So that's what that is. So I like that album. I think that's I like it.
I strongly encourage people to listen to your three albums, this one in particular, and forget the deep depression, although a nice little dram of scotch while you're listening to the Yule
Oh,
log would
goes
probably
a
go
long way.
really well.
Goes a
So
long way.
I'm going to go out with Some Children See Him. And the reason I chose that is because we do an annual Christmas show. Not It's a concert at a church, local church, Lutheran church. And there's a Philadelphia area Celtic singer with a beautiful voice, Charlie Zom.
Mm.
And he does a version of this song, it's just him and a guitar. And it's my highlight for seeing him every year. And I really like the way that your take on this. I just thought it was really good. This album really, and I read this in the review, but I think it's accurate. It sends a really great message about cultural perspectives on faith, particularly this particular piece, because you've got a whole bunch of people seeing the figure of Jesus Christ, but they're all seeing
Well, yeah,
him differently because that's how they were taught.
it's funny. I look at it a little bit deeper than that. I used to live in I used to live in Morocco some years back, and which is a Muslim country, and I remember going there, and my mom was like, it's a Muslim country, and I was like, yeah, they're right, fine, they have their beliefs, and I remember thinking to myself, like, when I was thinking about this music, like, we all have our beliefs, we all have our religions, some of us is Christian, some of us Jewish, some of us Muslim, and the thing about that is we all are different, but we kind of like we all things see like religion differently, although it's kind of sends the same messages all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like trying to piece my words carefully here, because most religions are about us bettering ourselves.
I think you're right.
And that song to me was just, I looked at it from the perspective of like, yes, all these people see Jesus differently, but all people see religion differently. And we're all still trying to better ourselves no matter who we are. So that's me looking at a larger picture of the song itself. And the words are beautiful.
They
They were
are.
written, they're absolutely beautiful. Who I think it was written by, I think, the best holiday Christmas composer ever, Alfred Burt. He's
Mm-hmm.
famous for caroling, and
Yep.
he has all these other ones that are like, wait, why aren't these songs famous? Like, it's like, why is these, like, nobody's talking about this? But that's another thing. They're very deep. They touch your soul. They reach very far into you to pull out who you are just a little bit more. And that's one of those pieces that any version you hear of it's absolutely beautiful. And he has a harmonic structure. That's another thing about Alfred Burr. He had a harmonic thing that he does that's not always found in all these other Christmas songs, to just push you just a little bit further, just to make you lean in a little bit more, just and it's absolutely beautiful.
How can listeners connect to you, both on your recordings as well as live gigs that you're doing in New York, Philly, wherever?
They can connect to me. Well, one, I'll be in Philly on April 20th. Um,
Absolutely. That's correct.
we are doing that. We are doing that. That'll be amazing. But you can catch me online. You can catch me. I have a website. I sell my music there. Um,
And that's
uh,
georgeburtonmusic.com, right?
yes, georgeburtonmusic.com. I'm on social media, sort of, kinda. I'm like a terrible social media person. I'm just the wrong generation. I like posting, and I'm like, I gotta get out of here. Um, but you can catch me there. You can catch me, yeah, Spotify, Apple Music, all the platforms. I'm on there, making lots and lots of money. Um, it's a joke, but
I figured, yes. We've talked about that here on Freeform Philly.
yeah,
It's a sad thing.
yeah, it's it's going to be what it is. Technology and the internet, it's beautiful double-edged sword. But you can catch me around on my website. Is the best place to find me and to find my music and to find where I am.
George, it's really been a pleasure to talk to you. It's really been more of a pleasure for me to get to know you and your family. Oh, we'll certainly have a great time on April 20th at the Kimmel Center with the Peter Nero tribute show. But I hope we can continue to stay connected, and I want to hear what you continue to do in the music.
Oh yeah, we're going to stay connected. Yes, but I'm like
Very good.
I'm thinking like music. I'm like already thinking what I'm going to do next. I got these moogs. So
Very good. Take care, George.
take care.